I want to thank Disaster Ready and the Cornerstone on Demand Foundation for inviting me to do this today, and thank you everyone for joining in. I hope that this will be a chance for those of you who haven't heard about the Listening Project or the results to hear a bit more about the voices and the perspectives of a lot of people around the world about how to make international aid more effective. Just as a bit of background, the Listening Project has been a hugely collaborative effort. It's involved more than 130 international and local aid agencies in the listening process itself, and over 100 additional organizations in the analysis of the evidence that we gathered. Between the end of 2005 and the end of 2009, CDA organized listening exercises in 20 countries. For a week to 2 weeks, the staff of a number of international and local organizations, many of whom are actually on the phone or have representatives on the phone, had conversations with a variety of local people about the long-term and the cumulative effects of international aid efforts. For most of the listeners, taking the time to listen like this was a new experience and a luxury, given the time pressures that a lot of them are under to implement projects quickly and to report on results. We listened to around 6,000 people who had received or been involved in the delivery of various types of assistance, so humanitarian assistance, development, peace building. And in fact, in many places, most places, people in communities don't make the distinctions and draw the hard lines that we do between different kinds of assistance. In each country, we listened to a wide range of local people, those who both directly and indirectly benefited from aid efforts, people who were involved in delivery, so local organizations, local government officials, local leaders. We also talked to business people, community members, academics, and other observers of international aid efforts. And we asked about their experiences and their observations of international aid efforts, what approaches worked, which did not, and how the many projects that many of them had experienced had added up over time or not. And we also asked them what should be done differently. So what did we hear? Well, first of all, people do believe that international aid is a good thing for the most part, and it's very much appreciated. There are a lot of good people and many good projects which people have benefited from and that they talked about and described. But overall, we found that people talked about how the many projects and the many efforts just don't seem to be adding up to the changes that they often want to see. In places as different as Angola, Ecuador, Timor-Leste, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Zimbabwe, and so on, people described very similar experiences with the processes of international aid efforts, and they explained how these often undermined the goals of the assistance that they received, participated in, or observed. Local people described how the policies and the procedures in the aid system seem to be are still very externally driven and too focused on the delivery of assistance. And they also talked about what a more collaborative aid approach and system could look like and how it could lead to more effective development. So for those of you who've already got the book, a hard copy of the book, there's a table on page 138 that shows the elements of the two paradigms that I'm going to be describing today, or it's on page 148 in the PDF version. And I will show a slide at the end that shows you how to access those as well. Sorry. So first of all, in the externally driven aid delivery system, local people are too often seen and even called beneficiaries and aid recipients. As a policeman in Thailand said, there was too much assistance too fast, and international agencies should be slower in their distribution. People should help themselves first and only request and receive assistance when they cannot help themselves. By giving out so easily, you are turning them into beggars. Some villages received too much to stop and think of the value of all the things they have been given. The arrival of assistance sends a very positive message that people care. People appreciate the solidarity that it represents and the good intentions of those that are providing aid. And they're especially appreciative when aid has saved their lives and when it helps them to achieve their goals. But too often, people described how cumulatively, over time, with project after project, the way that aid is provided is fueling dependency and powerlessness. And they talk about the growing number of actors that are involved in providing assistance and are often questioning their motivations. And many talked about how aid has become a business that seems to be much more concerned with its own survival than with their development. So they also talk about how in a collaborative aid system, local people would be treated as colleagues and drivers of their own development, and we wouldn't continue to call them beneficiaries and sort of treat them in that way. A second aspect of this externally driven aid delivery system is that aid providers focus on identifying needs. As a person in Kabul, Afghanistan said, donors look at immediate needs but may not be aware of why there's a problem. Why is the child sick? They need to stay longer to get an idea of the real problems. People describe how international aid has become this massive, multi-layered, and very complex delivery system that's focused on providing things: material goods, services, training, technical assistance, techniques, concepts, structures, even values, from donors to recipients based on assumptions of what is needed. The focus on delivery puts the programmatic focus on what is needed or seen to be missing rather than what already exists and is working. The starting point for engagement with affected populations is too often a focus on needs assessment rather than on existing capacities and strengths. However, we all know that meeting a need does not necessarily solve the problem that produced it, and if our assistance is not connected to existing capacities, it can undermine them. Now, for a business, this makes sense. Repeat customers provide a steady revenue base. But for donors and international aid agencies, the long history of focusing on needs has unfortunately perpetuated dependency rather than supporting self-reliance and lasting development. So in a collaborative aid system, aid providers would focus just as much and much more, frankly, on supporting and reinforcing capacities and on identifying local priorities, and a lot less on needs. A third aspect of this externally driven aid delivery system is that aid providers use pre-planned and predetermined programs. As the staff of a government-run rural development program in Mali said, donors want to put communities into the same mold. Instead of adapting project activities to fit the funding should be adapted to meet our needs. Donors should be tuned into our needs and priorities. They should not impose. They should ask for input from the bottom, from the grassroots level. Projects that parachute from on high will not succeed. While we've made a lot of progress in pre-positioning humanitarian assistance to reach people faster, these physical warehouses are paralleled by well-stocked digital libraries of proposal and reporting templates. How many times have we gone to our computer warehouses of ideas and language as we start new strategies and programs? This is one of the aspects of what people mean by aid coming to them in sort of prepackaged. And so the predetermined and prepackaged assistance is intended to improve efficiency and to help us respond faster to local needs. However, when aid providers scale up and implement standard approaches and projects without tailoring it to the conditions and demand in the local market, they often deliver the wrong things at the wrong time, in the wrong way, or to the wrong people. Many government officials and local people commented on how often this happens, and for them, how wasteful and therefore inefficient standard prepackaged programs are. They also described how aid is too often provided according to predetermined criteria or to promote particular donor agendas and priorities. And they talk about how these externally driven priorities have cascading effects on who receives assistance and the types of assistance that they even have access to. Local people and aid workers alike talked about how the current project cycles and the funding procedures don't really provide the time and resources to ensure that local people are meaningfully engaged in the assessments, analysis, and design of programs that really do build on their resources and meet their self-defined needs and aspirations. As an aid worker in Senegal said, donors need to be honest and forthright about what they really mean by participation. Is it simply a consultation with communities to get approval or support for a project that has already been predetermined, or really to decide jointly and to work together? So if we were to work in a much more collaborative way, we would have very context-relevant programs that would be developed jointly by recipient communities and aid providers. A fourth aspect of the current externally driven aid delivery system is that aid providers still drive most of the decision-making. As a local government official in Sri Lanka said, participatory planning is just a phrase. Money and time are limited from the donor side, and an agenda has already been set long before agencies go into communities. When we pursue efficiency in the delivery of aid, we've developed a lot of procedures to facilitate quicker responses and planning and decision-making. But the evidence from people who live in aid recipient societies shows that a lot of times the procedures that we've put in place have too often turned in on themselves. Providers and recipients alike talked about how a lot of the procedures and the sort of tick-the-box exercises just take too much time, they're inflexible, they're too complicated, or they're counterproductive. The staff of a lot of international and local agencies who were listening with us and who we listened to talked about how much time they have to spend ensuring compliance with rules and regulations. And they talk about how this takes time away from spending more time listening and engaging with people in communities. They talk about how the ways that sort of these tick-the-box processes have become so pervasive that they've lost sight of the very values and principles that they were meant to support. Proceduralization is sort of an awful term that we came up with based on the evidence that really overwhelmed us when we analyzed the thousands of conversations that we had with both aid providers and recipients. It's meant to mirror the word bureaucratization, and people who become procedurocrats get so mired in the complexity and detail of procedural compliance, often in the form of paperwork and reports, that they lose sight of the purposes of international aid. During the listening project, we heard so many people at so many levels describe these procedures as posing barriers to the achievement of effective assistance rather than facilitating it, that we had to recognize that a lot of parts of our international aid system have just become proceduralized. And the procedures we've developed to uphold good humanitarian and development principles are too often just not helping us to achieve the goals that they were intended to support. So let me give an example. We've developed a lot of policies and procedures that are meant to facilitate the participation of local people in aid efforts and ultimately in their own development. We have many books, manuals, and tools on participation. Our methods and procedures for ensuring participation of local people include surveys, community meetings, focus group discussions, participatory needs assessments, consultations, questionnaires, feedback mechanisms, and many other methods. But people described across all of these countries that we visited how these questionnaires, surveys, feedback forms often come with predetermined answers or multiple choice questions, which again predetermine the range of options that are open to them. They talk about how consultations become one-way presentations of sort of what is being planned or on offer, with little real opportunity to discuss what they would like to see done. And while they participate in different ways, the vast majority of people say that they don't feel included in the critical decision-making processes about the assistance that they receive. In their experiences, many of the decisions have been made before an agency arrives, and there are few, if any, real opportunities to contribute their ideas. One person summarized the experience of many people with the following statement: "This is how you conjugate participation. I participate, you participate, they decide." Aid recipients talked about how the procedures that are intended to elicit their participation are so fully predetermined and designed by outsiders that they don't provide meaningful engagement of people in recipient communities in the decisions about the aid that they receive. And many agree with a woman in Kenya who said, "There should be nothing about us without us." So in a collaborative aid system, we would have collaborative decision-making processes that include recipients and providers together deciding what should be done. A fifth aspect of this externally driven aid delivery system is that aid providers focus on spending on a predetermined schedule. As a government official in Afghanistan said, the lack of flexibility and short time spans for projects creates difficult conditions. Short time approaches are one of the main factors that instigate failure. In spite of this, the donors ask for sustainability. Many aid agencies, especially those who are engaged in humanitarian assistance, equate efficiency with timeliness, and timeliness is often interpreted to mean speed. Aid agencies are asked to submit proposals for projects to achieve grand goals on very fixed and regular schedules and often very brief prescribed periods. Delays are frowned upon, late submissions of proposals disqualifies applicants, and late submission of reports counts as poor management. These time pressures are causing donors and aid agencies to cut corners in terms of community consultations and to make assumptions about local context. The pressure to deliver in short project bursts is again seen by people on the recipient end as wasteful and inefficient. They talk about how while a business seeks rapid turnover of projects, local people believe that donors and aid agencies too often are seeking rapid turnover of projects. Even before one project is finished, they're writing a proposal for another project to follow. As a Lebanese PhD student and consultant said, working in templates is easy, but to do it right, you need more time and money and effort. Template projects get more visibility. Some donors come with results-based frameworks with all their definitions. This is meant to be a tool for better projects, but they spend half the year explaining what it is. So in a collaborative aid system, aid providers would fit money and timing to the strategy and the realities on the ground, rather than what's coming down from the top. The sixth aspect of the externally driven aid delivery system is that staff are too often evaluated and rewarded for managing projects on time and on budget. As the director of an international NGO on the Thai-Burma border said, donors demand task-focused work. staff would love to have more time to talk to people in the camp, spend the night in the camp, but we have projects due with facts and numbers, and it needs to be right to keep the funding coming. The donors are not helping us be respectful because they come with their new ideas, trends, and we have to jump. We end up with ridiculous time frames to do things. We cut out the process and spend the rest of the year doing damage control. When the focus of evaluations is on quantitative measures, the incentives for aid providers follow. They plan more community meetings or other events where they can count heads to demonstrate participation. Local and international staff talked about how donors and their agencies need to change the definitions of what is real work with what is important work. And they talked about the real challenges of measuring engagement and accountability with much more rigor and precision. The ways that donors and agencies evaluate their staff, partners, programs, and long-term impacts need to include assessments of how effectively they engage with a broad range of people and to what end. Partnerships and hiring decisions should reflect the value that donors and aid agencies say they put on ensuring meaningful engagement of people in the aid efforts that are meant to improve their lives. Many aid agency staff suggest that the skills that they need to engage with local people effectively, such as knowing the local languages, good listening, facilitation, and problem-solving skills, as well as cultural sensitivity and contextual knowledge, need to be valued in recruiting, included in competency frameworks, and assessed in staff evaluations. As one longtime aid worker admitted, it's a carrot, but where's the stick? The stick isn't there because you're probably not going to be fired if you're getting your funding, reaching goals, but not getting relationships right. So in a collaborative aid system, staff would be evaluated and rewarded for the quality of relationships and the results that recipients say make lasting positive changes in their lives. The seventh aspect of this externally driven aid delivery system is that our monitoring and evaluation is done by providers on project spending and the delivery of what's been planned. As the director of a Lebanese NGO said, what impact are you talking about? The impact is just spending money. Goods are delivered with no sense of social development. There's no interest to develop people. It's all reduced to practicality. Just know how to write a report. The focus is on skills put into the framework of outputs with no reflection included. Now, an efficient business keeps its costs down, and NGOs, contractors, and donors are mirroring this practice by monitoring and emphasizing low overheads as a common measure of efficiency. Because keeping low overhead costs low relative to program costs is assumed to mean that an agency spends its money directly on helping people, considered our outputs, rather than on headquarters salaries and offices representing inputs. Whether an agency delivers tangible goods or intangible services, its reporting on deliverables is often focused on cost per quantity delivered and whether the delivery was on time. But too often the process of achieving the deliverables is considered overhead and isn't what gets measured or valued appropriately. People in communities talked about how monitoring and evaluation processes focus on what's been done in relation to the stated plans rather than on what has happened because of what was done and how it was done. And they also care about lasting results. We heard over and over questions about why aid agencies never came back to see what had happened as a result of the assistance, not just to see if projects were sustainable, but whether the impacts had lasted and what had been the unintended side effects, both positive and negative. Although many aid providers are concerned to know impacts and certainly are being asked to report on them, many say they don't really track or report on the long-term and unexpected impacts or side effects of their actions because these are hard to trace, and they're not really required for the renewal of funding. In most cases, post-project monitoring and evaluation, much less long-term cumulative evaluations, are just not funded, particularly with today's emphasis on efficiency and value for money in the short term. Both aid recipients and aid providers talked about the need to measure quality and quantity and to look much more closely at the processes used to get results. They noted that just because something is measurable doesn't mean that it is what should be assessed. As an international aid worker noted, if 10 years ago we had more solidarity but couldn't show the results, was it because we couldn't figure out how to measure it? We should ask how local people see the changes. Another suggested that we just need to say yes to mess and to see that log frames are too narrow to measure many of the changes that we seek to support. So in a collaborative aid system, our monitoring and evaluation and follow-up would be done by providers and recipients on the results and the long-term effects of international assistance. So the last aspect of this externally driven aid delivery system that we have right now is that there's a focus on growth. As the director of a local NGO in Kenya said, many people view interventions as a money-making business, and the humanitarian as well as the volunteer spirit that was the driving force has disappeared, as most actors have become materialistic. Donors, implementing agencies, and local partners have come to equate success with growth of their budgets. Aid agency field directors say that they are promoted and respected if they grow their portfolios or budgets every year, and they gain little recognition when they manage to save money for their agencies or shut down operations. Donors also monitor the burn rate of spending to ensure that allocated funds are spent by the end of the year, even if it could do more harm than good. We found that more people in aid recipient societies described aid as being too much rather than not enough, and they focused on the need for smarter aid and to stop waste rather than to grow assistance. The drive to grow and to deliver more aid, while greatly appreciated in some disaster or conflict situations, also runs counter to recipient country goals of self-reliance and to donor policies to promote local ownership and sustainability. So if the purpose of international assistance is to help people so that they no longer need assistance, then those who are providing assistance should be working to grow smaller. That is, working to go out of business. So in a collaborative aid system, aid agencies would have a plan to draw down a mutually agreed exit and assistance strategy. Now, over many years, we've tried many different ways to improve how we provide assistance. We've tinkered around the edges of our externally driven aid delivery system with many different initiatives, statements of principles, and frameworks. But in spite of the improvements, people on the recipient side of aid are calling for an essential and a profound shift in the whole international aid paradigm. Now, to get at what they mean, we tried to sort of articulate compare what the theory of change behind our current externally driven aid delivery system is with the theory of change implied by the paradigm shift to a much more collaborative aid system that people are asking for. So our current theory of change seems to be that by efficiently providing tangible and intangible inputs, international actors can effectively cause, catalyze, or support positive economic, social, and political change in other countries. Now, this new paradigm shift the theory of change of a collaborative aid system would be that the role of international assistance in promoting positive social, political, and economic change is to expand the range of options that people in a society can consider, to engage with them in weighing the costs and benefits of each option, and from this to co-develop and co-implement a joint strategy for pursuing the changes that they seek. This new paradigm highlights the desired shift of aid recipients from a supply-driven aid delivery system that's focused on efficiency to a more engaged, collaborative, mutual problem-solving process that's much more concerned about effectiveness. Shifts in our thinking must be accompanied by shifts in incentives and behaviors for aid providers and also for people in aid recipient countries. A lot of our daily routines and relationships must change, sometimes radically. It's going to take each of us deciding to approach our work and our relationships with those we mean to support in a more meaningful way, to think long-term, and to truly aim to work ourselves out of a job. Now, that may be a scary thing to many of us. So how do we even begin? Well, we can start by looking at the primary instruments of international aid which are in our control. These are the policies, procedures, resources, and people. We need to focus and simplify our policies and our procedures on ways to truly engage local people every step of the way, and particularly in the decisions which will affect their lives, even during emergencies. We need to rethink how we allocate our resources to ensure that we really do understand the local context and that we are investing in and collaborating in very meaningful ways with local people and institutions so that they can drive the process and achieve their own recovery and development. And lastly, we need to redefine the critical attributes and credentials of those we hire and work with to ensure they can meaningfully engage and collaborate with those international aid efforts aimed to support. We found that every story of effective aid told by aid recipients included a description of particular people who worked in ways that had developed respect and trust with those they were trying to help. In fact, many times people could name very specific people that they could remember even years later who had acted in ways that they felt were very collaborative and respectful. Over and over again, we heard how people and good leadership really matter. And because donors and aid agencies develop their own policies and procedures, and they decide how they will allocate resources and define the skills which are important to their work, they can change them, and they can start doing this right now. I don't have time to go into sort of all the details today, but there's a whole chapter on this in the book, and I encourage you to read it and really to try to act on the voices for change that we've heard. And finally, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm really honored to have had the chance to share a lot of the voices, well, just a few, frankly, of the voices that we've heard from people in aid recipient communities who want to be able to collaborate much more with us. In the words of a woman in Ecuador who was among the many who really wanted to have their voices heard by donors and international aid agencies, thank you for listening to us and allowing us to tell you what we would like to tell those who have power over this great power that is international cooperation. So, to kick us off, if she were here today, she would probably want to ask you, what can you do to help shift the paradigm in the way you do your job, in how your program or department works, across your organization, with your partners and stakeholders, in your networks, or even in the humanitarian clusters? So I want to thank you for listening, and I think we'll open it up to questions and answers, and frankly, feedback and comments as well. Thanks.
Dana, this is George. Thank you very much. Dana and Jeanette, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Dana, thank you very much for that presentation. You've covered a lot of ground very succinctly. We've got a number of excellent questions queued up for you. So let me start with one of the, I'd say, one of the more complimentary ones. I'll pitch it to you, and then I'll keep them coming as folks are submitting. And again, if you have a question or a comment, please submit them to all panelists in your chat box. The first question is, I want to thank Dana and Mary Anderson for this wonderful book. What has been the reception to the book by international NGOs? Are some of them doing changes in aid delivery in line with what's written in the book?
Great. Good question. We've had, I think, very good responses from a lot of international NGOs and donors. We've been doing a lot of presentations, frankly, over the last 6 months or so, and discussions. And there's a lot of recognition by people that this is sort of the system that we're in, and also, I think, a common recognition that people want to change it. A lot of the responses have also been, we need to get from international NGOs is sort of pointing the finger at the next level, saying, the donors need to change, and then we will change. And, I think while that is all very much true, there's also quite a lot of looking inside from a number of organizations of what, we pushed back and said, well, there's actually quite a lot of control that you exert and that you have, and that you can change even without waiting for your donors to do so. And there are some that are trying to, make some of the changes that are needed, in terms of, I think it's, there are certainly some organizations that are working in much more collaborative ways like this, and I think part of the challenge is also even sharing that with others. And one of the things, though, that is, I think, is unfortunate and challenging is that while there's this recognition of the issues, we're also faced with an even more competitive funding climate. And so while people are worried and know they're often cutting corners, they're having a hard time sometimes making the case for those investments being made to ensure that they really can collaborate with people. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thanks for that. All right, we have a number of questions, Dana, about surprise, surprise donors, the role donors can and should play in this equation, and what sort of reception you've been receiving from them. Let me read you one or two of them and then hear your thoughts. They're all of a similar vein. First one is, this is a long overdue dialogue. We have wandered far from the ideals of development as we race to scale up and meet donor demands as opposed to local needs. Another comment that came in is, okay, earlier in the presentation, Dana touched upon wasted resources and how sometimes the aid being provided has a lesser impact than intended. What would you say to potential donors of either time and or money who are faced with many, many different organizations all trying to accomplish the same goal? Where would one start in figuring out how to choose one organization over another in hopes of maximizing his or her donor's impact? And one more along the same vein. Right.
Hello?
The question is, what has been the reaction by donors thus far to the book, and how realistic do you think it is that donors will change the way they work? Do you have any concrete examples of donors that are beginning to take this advice on board? So I've thrown a bunch of them at you there, Dana. Apologies, but they're all in a similar vein. Can you speak to that question of the role that donors should be playing, and also what has been the reaction thus far that you've seen from them based on some of the learnings presented in the book?
Sure. I think on the sort of where to start in choosing amongst organizations, I think that there is not enough, frankly, assessment and sort of in due diligence processes are often not looking at the perspective of the communities and getting their views on which organizations are effective, which organizations are working with them in a more collaborative way, where they feel respected, where they are able to help, participate in the decision making, where they feel like this is really a good partner. So approaching partnerships from the perspective of the communities, because frankly they should be involved in that. There are some organizations that use tripartite agreements where community, whether their local development committee or some local institution is involved in signing an agreement with the local partner and the donor. And so that sets up a mutual accountability. It sets up a different kind of relationship. But most of the time, these partnering decisions are made either at headquarters or, maybe in the capital city. But a lot of the things that are being looked at are often about whether organizations can manage projects well, and not necessarily about how well they engage with communities. Do they really represent the local communities? One of the most sort of memorable conversations I had was actually in Kosovo, where someone with a think tank described after many years of investments and millions of dollars that went into civil society organizations, and let's fund local partners. All this money needs to go through local implementing partners. And he said at the end of the day, what donors had done was to create a project society, not a civil society. And so we need to find a way to balance both. How do we, accomplish the short-term goals that we have? We want to get these projects implemented. We also want to try to support local institutions and local capacity, but making sure we're doing this in a way that actually supports those organizations to play a role in the long-term development of their country. That we're not just seeing them as implementers and sort of part of the project chain, but how are they playing a role in the policy making and engagement in decision making and bringing new ideas in their local context? Do they have a constituency? Are they representative of the local community? We heard in a number of countries, and so the comments from Kenya were reflective of what's really seen to be a lot of sort of a real growth industry of local organizations and a lot of briefcase NGOs, a lot of pocket NGOs, that there's a lot of people who, are starting organizations because this is a way to get funding, but they're not really committed necessarily to the ideals. And I think that that's something that, donors and a lot of international NGOs, frankly, are seen as donors because they are in many countries funding local partners. And a lot of local communities wonder why there isn't a lot more sort of checking up and verification and really just, listening to their views on those partners and their performance from the communities and involving them in assessing whether they're good partners to work with, whether that be an international NGO or a local NGO. One of the things that we hear from donors and well is that they often do not know, unless someone's actually changed missions, they may not know the reputation or the work of an organization in one country to another. And so you kind of, there's assumptions that, these guys should be great. Well, there's a lot of variance, unfortunately. Even when agencies have, global frameworks and standards, we all know that they're not upheld equally country by country. So that would be, one. On the reactions by the donors, there's quite a lot of recognition. Some of them think that we've moved further than we have. There is the articulation of a lot of this in the Busan Global Partnership for International, the outcome document that came out of the fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness in Busan lays out a lot of, the same ideas in terms of promoting local ownership, that this should be from the ground up and so on. But the problem is that most of these agreements have not led to changes in the policies and the procedures and the systems of donors themselves. And so one of the reasons they're so behind in implementing a lot of these things is that they're still trying to do what they do in the same way. I do see some positive changes from a number of donors that are trying to change the way they do things and the questions that they're asking. I know DFID is certainly focusing on and asking a lot more questions about beneficiary feedback as a way of sort of emphasizing that we need to be listening to and getting feedback and closing the feedback loop. So they're, looking at how are we providing information, how are people given the opportunity to comment on and to be involved in and influencing what we do. But it's still, we still have a long way to go from what I would say is giving people more voice to giving people more choice, where they're actually involved in the decision making. And obviously for a lot of donors, that's a little bit more difficult. Most of them talk about, for bilateral donors, there are political sensitivities and so on. But for a lot of the donors, frankly, are international NGOs, our foundations, and our others who don't have the same restrictions and ought to be able to find ways to involve people much more to really live up to, the values and the principles that they, are espousing and say that their work is all about.
Great. Thank you, Dana. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we have a flood of excellent, fairly difficult questions coming your way. So let me start with one that deals really with the question of incentives. And obviously, this is a steep challenge, as many of our attendees have mentioned in their comments and in their questions. We've been doing aid this way for so long. It's largely calcified, and it appears almost monolithic. And so several of our attendees have been asking, how do we start to chip away at that? Here's one question. If staff are evaluated and rewarded on timely delivery of projects, then how does it relate to capacity building and development amongst local actors? Given that the collaborative aid system, the focus seems to be on capacity development, and we know that this takes time to ensure the communities are empowered to take charge of their own lives. Clearly, there's a disconnect between these two things. Any thoughts on how this could be improved?
I think one of the biggest problems is actually our projectization. We have, our unit of engagement is the project, and so we build everything around that. And what we are missing and what communities talk about is, we need to take a much more holistic and a longer-term view. And so if we are looking at, capacity building does take time, and you're probably working to do that through multiple projects, through multiple interventions. And there are, in most cases, in many communities, there are multiple agencies working there at the same time. So some ideas would be looking at, could we take a community-based approach to monitoring and evaluation? So can we, across agencies, across donors that are investing in a certain location, whether it be at a village or a district, I could find a better unit rather than the project to look at, okay, what are we trying to do here? What are we accomplishing? Are the linkages that we assume are being made? Are we working at cross purposes sometimes, or is one project in fact undermining another project? And looking at measuring and our efforts in a different way, looking either at the community, kind of in a collective, what's our collective impact at a certain level? And I mean, that would obviously take a big shift, but this listening project was an example of that, and many donors and a lot of organizations. In the back of the book, we list everybody who participated, agreed that we need to look at this across all of our projects. It's not just what are we as an agency doing, but all of the work that we're doing, and is it really leading to better results on a collective basis? And that would be a way to involve communities to look at and to do those comparisons and to say, what's working, what's not, to ultimately build that capacity. So that would certainly be one idea. I think that would really help us to go a long way. And also, we could do that even at a sectoral level. We haven't really, we do a little bit of that, but a lot of times everything is about the agency and the project, and really not looking at this in a much more joined up way. And that could be a way of also bringing in the government and the private sector. And so that's where some of the social accountability mechanisms are going, in terms of looking at service delivery and the quality of services and whether people are happy with them, which gets to the end goal and not just about whether your agency, was viewed to be good. At the end of the day, did you contribute to ultimately a better result for people that they're happy with?
Great. Thank you, Dana. There's two questions that are fairly similar, and they both relate to the theory of change that you presented. I think it's on your slide 37. Would you mind jogging back up to that theory of change for a collaborative aid system? There we go. So here are the two questions. Can you ask if there are good examples to serve as guidance for us? Thanks. And relating to that, which INGOs would you say, or did you hear from the recipients of aid in your book, have made a concerted effort to internalize and actively push the theory of change for a more collaborative aid system? Now, obviously, you're being asked to name names, but since you're being asked to name positive examples, I don't think anyone will get their nose out of joint. So did you hear anything through the research or subsequently that enables you to point to good examples that you've seen out there?
Sure. In fact, you're right. I mean, we very much avoided and want to avoid, naming names because this wasn't about comparing agencies, but rather approaches. But I guess on the good side, like you said, it wouldn't be too bad. I mean, certainly some of the positive examples that we heard were where people talked about an approach that was longer term, that engaged people in a different way, where people were present and were really there sort of throughout and not kind of dropping in, but had some way that there were local community mobilizers and community, leaders, people that were trained and able to take people and communities through a whole process of identification and analysis of their problems and opportunities and resources and capacities, and to develop, come up with ideas of what would be ways to address those, and a plan to do so. I know that in a few places we heard about agencies who had been gone even for a number of years. For example, in Ethiopia, we were in one area where I think ActionAid had been there and had left like 7 years before, and people were still raving about the very, the approach that they had taken. And I think those that are familiar with ActionAid takes a very, deliberative sort of longer term, ground up approach, and that was something that was noted and appreciated by quite a lot of people. It's also very hard to get the investment in that sometimes, because it might be a year before you actually quote unquote start something, but there's a whole lot of work that is done in helping people to be really much more engaged in this process throughout before they actually began any projects. Another aspect that we heard, and this was a number of organizations do this, is a graduated approach to investment where, initially the communities provide a smaller percentage of contributions in terms of money and labor and time, and that over time they increase their contribution and the International Aid Agency decreases theirs. And so it's, it is a learning process. There's a lot of desire for sort of more accompaniment and being there to work with people through the challenges. They don't believe on this, part of this theory of change is that there's a real role that they see for outsiders to come in and to bring ideas and experiences of what has worked elsewhere. But to explain to them and to really analyze, okay, so why did that work in this place, and why would that possibly work or not work here, and how might we need to adjust that? And then to evaluate, as we're going along, is that working or not? Because every context is different, but that doesn't mean that there aren't approaches that have worked elsewhere that could work in other places. I mean, that's what we try to do with scaling up, but too often we don't go through that analysis process of, well, what might work in this place with people themselves. We do that before we even have those conversations, and we kind of present these range of options too often of what we think might work in this place. And so one of the other things that we've heard a lot of, we heard people happy with the idea having peer exchanges where people can actually visit and talk with other people who've had similar problems and learn from their experiences and what's worked and what's not. So, exchange visits. And I think there's a real value for aid agencies also in this peer exchange and really peer review and to learn from one another by visiting each other's projects or, approaches, or even doing joint trainings and sharing to break down a lot of these barriers. I mean, we heard a lot of comments from people that the competition between agencies is actually really something that people see, and it's palpable, and it trickles down to communities. I think on the on the negative side, there certainly were some places where there were different community committees that were set up by different international NGOs to do more or less the same thing. And they were almost sort of competing. They weren't even collaborating. And so how are we able to, look at our again, at our kind of collective approach, and in some regions could we look at what's working, even at a country level, and sharing amongst NGOs.
Great. Thanks, Dana. All right, so we've got a little more than 5 minutes left and several good questions queued up. The first one, Dana, if you could go to your slide 25, there was a very telling quote from an international NGO manager, I believe, about the various pressures we're under in emergency situations. Several of the folks with us today have asked a variation of this question. We don't have the luxury of time in emergencies to take that much time to listen. So what do you suggest we do differently? How can we listen to a range of voices with the time and funding restrictions we face in emergencies?
Yes, it is a common pressure, and I obviously, especially when you're responding to natural disasters, there is, a real pressure to just initially save lives and to get out and do what we possibly can. But I think there's always a way for people, for agencies to have somebody that's out there talking with people and understanding. And I think a big part of it is not that we're not doing that, but what's lacking often is sort of a systematic way for the ideas and the resources and capacities that people talk about, and not just sort of their needs, to be brought into our assessment processes. And so how are we, there are ways to do that by having, it might be that you actually just have certain staff that's initially they go out and their whole job is to sort of be community liaisons, or how, you can come up with whatever title it might be. But they're out there listening to and understanding, what people's experiences have been, what life was like before this happened, and what resources and capacities they had, and not just see them as sitting there in need right now, and looking at what you can do to involve people much more in the design. Especially, a lot of proposal writing in emergencies is done, in the first few weeks, and there ought to be time to doing even some more focus group discussions involving people and saying, here's what we're thinking would be helpful. And having that back and forth in a discussion, forming some local group, or finding a local group, in many cases may already have existed, that you can engage with, but being very mindful of of power dynamics, of whether you are hearing from a range of voices. And so I think one of the challenges is often, in some cases, it does make sense to try to obviously work with local institutions that already exist, or local groups, but we often don't do enough background work and research to know, actually they represent only the majority group. There's no minority voices here. We're not reaching the most vulnerable. There's certain people that are excluded, and that the interests of only one or certain groups are being represented. And so we need to be much more cognizant of that and pay attention to that. And so having staff that are trained to do that, that are expected to do that, and to bring that to the discussions, and ideally to bring people from affected communities into the decision-making process in some way. And I think that, I understand the need for speed and the time pressures, that people are under, but there's always a way to listen to local voices, and to just, spend some time really understanding what people are experiencing, and what they already can bring to the table, that they're not certainly sitting there without anything to contribute.
Great. Thank you, Dana. Dana, some folks have asked how they can get in touch with you. Would you mind going back to your final slide that has your contact details on it? And while we're doing that, two fairly quick questions for you here. One, do you have an alternative word for beneficiary that you might suggest? The age-old question. And then secondly, another interesting one, have you had any experience using social media, for example, Twitter or other things, to listen to people in the field during a response?
The beneficiary word. It's a really hard one. We've actually did a blog on this, and and I think a number of people, some youth participants doesn't always capture it. Obviously, stakeholders, change agents. There are a range of words that people use, and I just wonder if we can't, say. I mean, we in the book use local people or people in aid recipient societies. We really tried to avoid using the word beneficiary, and part of that was because a lot of the people we listened to, we weren't sure if they were beneficiaries. And some of them were, but some of them weren't, and some of them were assumed to be indirect beneficiaries, if you will. But it really does, maintain this sort of charity mentality rather than this collaborative approach. I don't have a perfect term. I think that we, can we talk about people? I mean, we use affected people sometimes. That's still a little bit of a hard one, and I think it also depends on the local language and what would work there. Unfortunately, I don't have a perfect idea. Collaborators, maybe that would be great if we were really to work towards this collaborative approach. That would be a wonderful shift in our dialogue. On the social media side, we have not, as you can tell, this is kind of an old-fashioned sit under the tree and listen to people and talk to people, very low-tech approach, but also very time-intensive. There are a lot of agencies that have done quite a bit of work, particularly in emergencies, and some have written up, lessons learned from using social media. I think, especially in emergencies, Haiti and other places, there was certainly a lot of, and a lot of organizations are looking at, using different kinds of technology for how they gather feedback, and also providing information, and in some cases providing responses. The biggest concern I have is, of course, who has access to that. And if you're in a place where there's high density, but also, do women and children and other people that you want to be hearing from have access? Are the loudest voices, the ones that get heard? I think there's, growing opportunities to do that. And obviously, Ushahidi and others have done some really great stuff with crowdsourcing, and I think Global Giving is doing some interesting work with sort of using stories to understand impacts. I think there's a long way to go, and there's some real opportunities, but I think we have to be really cautious of who has access and whose stories and whose views are being heard. And just in the same way, as who we chose and were able to talk to affects what we heard. And just paying attention to that and having some way to analyze that in what you're getting off of social media.
Great. Dana, we're just about done, but I've got 2 more questions for you, and then in keeping with our 1-hour limit, we'll start to wrap up. The question that has come up from a couple of folks really relates to the broader topic of accountability, and so much of what we're talking about and what you present in the book are suggestions and observations and comments on accountability and how to improve that in the way we respond to emergencies. Are there any resources out there that already exist, besides your book, that can help guide aid workers as they try to make this case within their own agency, amongst their own colleagues, in interagency fora when they're on the ground, as someone noted earlier, competing with other NGOs for the attention of donors, and perhaps even with donors to help them make that sort of paradigm shift you're referring to in the book? The Good Enough Guide out of the ECB project comes to mind with its focus on accountability and impact. Are there other resources that you became aware of through this research that might be helpful to practitioners?
Yes, actually the stuff that we're aware of has come out more sort of at the end, if you will, and sort of as we've been writing. I think there's a lot of, obviously there's, tons of manuals, and you can look at a lot of the things that Robert Chambers and others have written in terms of participatory methods and the values, and there's a lot more measurement that's being done, I think, to show the value of that in a number of ways. On the accountability front, obviously HAP, the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, has a number of good resources, and there's a study that actually was just done, an impact assessment that was done just recently, funded by a consortium of agencies that looked at this whole impact question of do accountability mechanisms work? And it's on HAP's website. A consultant named Andy Featherstone did that. It came out very recently that looked at and took the DAC criteria, which of course the donors like and use, and tried to look at do these accountability mechanisms make a difference, and showed that they do in terms of quality of programming, in terms of effectiveness, relevance, all, the standard DAC criteria. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, but I think the methodology that they used was also very, it was innovative and it was good and it was very participatory. And so that, and the idea behind this evaluation that was done of Save the Children and Christian Aid's work in, it was Save's work in Burma and in Myanmar and the Delta, and Christian Aid in Kenya. Just two cases, but the idea is that the methodology could be used elsewhere and by other agencies. And so that's one piece. I think we're doing research also with ALNAP to try to look at beneficiary feedback mechanisms in humanitarian settings. We'll be coming out with final case studies and some guidance and lessons learned on that later this year. We did a desk study a couple of years ago on beneficiary feedback mechanisms in international aid agencies and looked at what seemed to be working and not. Now, again, this is about, people being able to have more voice. It's still not quite getting us to the choice, but I think it's helpful. It's on our website as well. And our website just literally went live yesterday, so if resources aren't there, they are on our old website, which I think this will still take you to. So there's a number of, and I think if you, through the, obviously through the ALNAP, there are quite a lot of resources as well, and there's the whole, I'll just stop there.
Good. All right, so that's a shout out for ALNAP, HAP, and HAP's website in particular, as well as the Good Enough Guide. I think based on the questions, there's keen interest amongst folks to get their hands on additional tools and guides that could help them in this admittedly very challenging process that we've been talking about today. So let me just conclude, Dana, by saying that several folks have asked if they could get a copy of your PowerPoint, and I'm happy to say that in a couple days' time, when the recording of this webinar is posted on disasterready.org, alongside it, we will also post, and Dana has given us her permission to do this, her PowerPoint along with her notes embedded in that PowerPoint. So please look for it on disasterready.org when you get a chance. And also, for those of you who have submitted questions, and I'm so sorry that we're out of time, we really do try to stick to 1 hour to respect all of your schedules, but there are still a number of excellent questions that we did not get to today. We will be passing those to Dana, and my hope is that Dana may be able to respond directly to those of you who posed questions that we didn't get to. Dana, there's lots of thank yous and great presentations and other things popping up in the chat box. I want to add my thanks as well. If you could just advance to the last slide that we have today. Let me just remind folks, if you haven't already, please take a look at disasterready.org, where we have not only news about upcoming webinars like the one you listened to today, but also recordings of all of our previous webinars that you can watch at your leisure or share with your colleagues. So again, if you haven't already checked it out, please do so. Having said that, Dana, thank you again very much for your time today. Appreciate all your efforts along with your co-authors in developing this much needed and certainly thought-provoking book, and wish you the best of luck as you continue to promote it and try to get the word out. So again, thanks very much, Dana.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for participating and for all the great questions.